Good day, everyone. I'm Oliver Palma, your discussant for today, and my topic is under Chapter 14, The West Between the Wars. After World War I, Europe was faced with severe economic problems. Most devastating of all was the Great Depression that began at the end of 1929. The Great Depression brought misery to millions of people. Begging for food on the streets became widespread, especially when soup kitchens were unable to keep up with the demand. More and more people were homeless and moved around looking for work and shelter. One observer in Germany reported an almost unbroken chain of homeless men extends the whole length of the great Hamburg-Berlin highway. Whole families had piled all their goods into baby carriages and wheelbarrows that they were pushing along as they plodded forward in dumb despair. In the United States, the homeless set up shantytowns they named Hoovervilles after President Herbert Hoover. In their misery, some people saw suicide as the only solution. One unemployed person said, "Today, when I am experiencing this for the first time, I think that I should prepare to do away with myself, to take gas, to jump into the river or leap from some high place." Would I really come to such a decision? I do not know. Social unrest spread rapidly. Some of the unemployed staged hunger marches to get attention in democratic countries. People began to listen to and vote for radical voices calling for extreme measures. I'm going to discuss Section 1, the futile search for stability, and the Section 2, the rise of dictatorial regimes. Section 1, the futile search for stability. On October 27, 1932, a group of workers marched in London to protest government policies. One observer reported, "By midday, approximately 100,000 London workers were moving towards Hyde Park from all parts of London to give the greatest welcome to the hunger marchers that had ever seen in Hyde Park." As the lost contingent of marchers entered the park gates, trouble broke out with the police. It started with the special constables or the police officers not being used to their task. They lost their heads and as the crowd swept forward onto the space where the meetings were to be held, the specials drew their truncheons or the billy clubs in an effort to control the sea of surging humanity. This incensed the workers, who turned on the constables and put them to flight. Worker unrest was but one of the social problems in Europe in 1920s and 1930s. Uneasy peace, uncertain security. The peace settlement at the end of World War I had tried to fulfill 19th century dreams of nationalism by creating new boundaries and new states. From the beginning, however, the settlement left nations unhappy. Border disputes poisoned relations in Eastern Europe for years. Many Germans vowed to revise the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, a weak League of Nations. President Woodrow Wilson had realized that the peace settlement included unwise provisions that could serve as new causes for conflict. He had placed many of his hopes for the future in the League of Nations. This organization, however, was not very effective in maintaining the peace. One problem was the failure of the United States to join the League. Most Americans did not wish to involve in European affairs. The U.S. Senate, despite Wilson's wishes, refused to ratify or approve the Treaty of Versailles. That meant the United States could not be a member of the League of Nations, which automatically weakened the organization's effectiveness. As time would prove, the remaining League members could not agree to use force against aggression. French demands. Between 1919 and 1924, desire for security led the French government to demand strict enforcement of the Treaty of Versailles. This top policy toward Germany began with the issue of reparations, which were the payments that the Germans were supposed to make for the damage they had done in the war. In April 1921, the Allied Reparations Commission determined that Germany owed 132 billion German marks, or equivalent to 33 billion US dollars, for reparations, payable in annual installments of 2.5 billion marks. The new German Republic made its first payment in 1921. By the following year, however, the German government, faced with financial problems, announced that it was unable to pay anymore. France was outraged and sent troops to occupy the Ruhr Valley, Germany's chief industrial and mining center. France planned to collect reparations by operating and using the Ruhr mines and factories. Inflation in Germany. The German government adopted a policy of passive resistance to French occupation. German workers went on strike and the government mainly paid their salaries by printing more paper money. This only added to the inflation or the rise in prices that had already begun in Germany by the end of war. The Great Flu Epidemic. A flu epidemic at the end of World War I proved disastrous to people all over the world. Some observers believe that it began among American soldiers in Kansas. When they were sent abroad to fight, they carried the virus to Europe. By the end of 1918, many soldiers in European armies had been stricken with the flu. The disease spread quickly throughout Europe. The three chief statesmen at the peace conference, the American President Woodrow Wilson, the British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, and the French Premier Georges Clemenceau, all were sick with the flu during the negotiations that led to the Treaty of Versailles. The Spanish flu, as this strain of influenza was called, was known for its swift and deadly action. Many people died within a day of being infected. Complications also arose from bacterial infection in the lungs, which caused a deadly form of pneumonia. In 1918 and 1919, the Spanish flu spread around the world with devastating results. Death tolls were enormous. In Russia, 450,000. In India, at least 6 million. In the United States is 550,000. It has been estimated that 22 million people, or more than twice the number of people killed in the World War I, died from the Great Flu epidemic between 1918 and 1919. The German mark soon became worthless. In 1914, 4.2 marks equaled into 1 US dollar. By November 1, 1923, it took 130 billion marks to equal $1. By the end of November, the ratio had increased to an incredible 4.2 trillion marks to $1. Evidence of runaway inflation was everywhere. Workers used wheelbarrows to carry home their weekly pay. One woman left a basket of money outside while she went into a store. When she came out, the money was there, but the basket had been stolen. Economic adversity led to political upheavals, and both France and Germany began to seek a way out of the disaster. In August 1924, an international commission produced a new plan for reparations. The DOS plan, named after the American banker who chaired the commission, first reduced reparations. It then coordinated Germany's annual payments with its ability to pay. The DOS plan was also granted to an initial $200 million loan for Germany recovery. This loan soon opened the door to heavy American investment in Europe. A brief period of European prosperity followed, but it only lasted from 1924 to 1929. The Treaty of Locarno. With prosperity came a new European diplomacy. A spirit of cooperation was fostered by the foreign ministers of Germany and France, Gustav Stresemann and Aristide Briand. In 1925, they signed the Treaty of Locarno, which guaranteed Germany's new western borders with France and Belgium. The Locarno Pact was viewed by many as the beginning of a new era of European peace. On the day after the pact was concluded, the headlines in the New York Times read, "France and Germany ban war forever." The London Times declared peace at last. The new spirit of cooperation grew even stronger when Germany joined the League of Nations in March 1926. 2 years later, the Kellogg-Briand Pact brought even more hope. 63 nations signed this accord written by U.S. Secretary of State Frank B. Kellogg and French Foreign Minister Aristide Briand. These nations pledged to renounce war as an instrument of national policy. Nothing was said, however, about what would be done if any more violated the pact. Unfortunately, the spirit of Locarno was based on little real substance. Promises not to go to war were worthless without a way to enforce these promises. Furthermore, not even the spirit of Locarno could convince nations to cut back on their weapons. The League of Nations Covenant had suggested that nations reduce their military forces to make war less probable. Germany, of course, had been forced to reduce its military forces. At that time, it was thought that the other states would later do the same. However, states were simply unwilling to trust their security to anyone but their own military forces. The brief period of prosperity that began in Europe in 1924 ended in an economic collapse that came to be known as the Great Depression. A depression is a period of low economic activity and rising unemployment. Two factors played a major role in the start of the Great Depression. One important factor was a series of downturns in the economies of individual nations in the second half of the 1920s. By the mid-1920s, for example, prices for farm products, especially wheat, were falling rapidly because of overproduction. The second factor in the coming of the Great Depression was an international financial crisis involving the U.S. stock market. We have seen that much of the European prosperity became 1924 and 1929 was built on U.S. bank loans to Germany. Germany needed the U.S. loans to pay reparations to France and Great Britain. During the 1920s, the U.S. stock market was booming. By 1928, American investors had begun to pull money out of Germany to invest in it in the stock market. Then in October 1929, the US stock market crashed and the prices of stocks plunged. In a panic, US investors withdrew even more funds from Germany and other European markets. This withdrawal weakened the banks of Germany and other European states. The Credit Anstalt Vienna's most famous bank collapsed in May 1931. Other banks soon followed, industrial production declined, and unemployment rose. Governments did not know how to deal with the crisis. They tried the traditional solution of cutting costs by lowering wages and raising protective tariffs to exclude foreign goods from home markets. These measures made the economic crisis worse, however, and had serious political effects. One effect of the economic crisis was increased government activity in the economy. This occurred even in countries that, like the United States, had a strong laissez-faire tradition, a belief that the government should not interfere in the economy. Another effect was a renewed interest in Marxist doctrines. Marx's prediction that capitalism would destroy itself through overproduction seemed to be coming true. Communism thus became more popular, especially among workers and intellectuals. Finally, the Great Depression led masses of people to follow political leaders who offered simple solutions in return for dictatorial power Everywhere, democracy seemed on the defensive in the 1930s. Democratic states after the war. President Woodrow Wilson had claimed that the war had been fought to make the world safe for democracy. In 1919, his claim seemed justified. Most major European states and many minor ones had democratic governments. In a number of states, women could not vote. Male political leaders had rewarded women for their contributions to the war effort by granting them voting rights. Exceptions were France, Italy, and Switzerland. Women gained the right to vote in 1944 in France, 1945 in Italy, and 1971 in Switzerland. In the 1920s, Europe seemed to be returning to the political trends of the pre-war era, parliamentary regimes, and the growth of individual liberties. This was not, however, as an easy process. 4 years of total war and 4 years of post-war turmoil made a return to normalcy difficult. The Imperial Germany of William II had come to an end in 1918 with Germany's defeat in the war. A German democratic state known as Weimar Republic was then created. The Weimar Republic was plagued by problems. For one thing, the republic had no truly outstanding political leaders. In 1925, Paul von Hindenburg, a World War I military hero, was elected president at the age of 77. Hindenburg was a traditional military man who did not fully endorse the republic he had been elected to serve. The Weimar Republic also faced serious economic problems. As we have seen, Germany experienced runaway inflation in 1922 and 1923. With it came serious social problems. Widows, teachers, civil servants, and others who live on fixed incomes all watch their monthly incomes become worthless or their life savings disappear. These losses increasingly push the middle class toward political parties that were hostile to the republic. To make matters worse, after a period of relative prosperity from 1924 to 1929, Germany was struck by the Great Depression. In 1930, unemployment had grown to 3 million people by March and to 4.38 million by December. The Depression paved the way for fear and the rise of extremist parties. After the defeat of Germany, France became the strongest power on the European continent. Its greatest need was to rebuild the areas that had been devastated in the war. However, France too suffered financial problems after the war because it had a more balanced economy than other nations. France did not begin to feel the full effects of the Great Depression until 1932. The economic instability it then suffered soon had political effects. During a 19-month period in 1932 and 1933, 6 different cabinets were formed as France faced political chaos. Finally, in June 1936, a coalition of leftist parties, communists, socialists, and radicals formed the Popular Front government. The Popular Front started a program for workers that some have called the French New Deal. This program was named after the New Deal in the United States that discussed later in this section. The French deal gave workers the right to collective bargaining, or the right of unions to negotiate with employers over wages and hours. A 40-hour work week in industry, a 2-week paid vacation, and a minimum wage. The Popular Front policies, however, failed to solve the problems of the Depression. By 1938, the French had little confidence in their political system. During the war, Britain had lost many of the markets for its industrial products to the United States and Japan. Such industries as coal, steel, and textiles declined after the war, leading to a rise in unemployment. In 1921, 2 million Britons were out of work. Britain soon rebounded, however, and
experienced limited prosperity from 1925 to 1929. By 1929, Britain faced the growing effects of the Great Depression. The Labour Party, which had become the largest party in Britain, failed to solve the nation's economic problems and fell from power in 1931. A new government led by the Conservatives claimed credit for bringing Britain out of the worst stages of the Depression. It did so by using the traditional policies of balanced budgets and protective tariffs. Political leaders in Britain largely ignored the new ideas of a British economist, John Maynard Keynes, who published his general theory of employment, interest, and money in 1936. He condemned the old theory that in a free economy, depressions should be left to resolve themselves without governmental interference. Keynes argued that unemployment came not from overproduction but from a decline in demand. Demand in turn could be increased by putting people back to work, building highways and public buildings. The government should finance such projects even if it had to engage in deficit spending or had to go into debt. After Germany, no Western nation was more affected by the Great Depression than the United States. By 1932, U.S. industrial production had fallen almost 50% from its 1929 level. By 1933, there were more than 12 million unemployed. Under these circumstances, the Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt was able to win a landslide victory in the 1932 presidential election. A believer in free enterprise, Roosevelt realized that capitalism had to be reformed if it was to be saved. He pursued a policy of active government intervention in the economy known as the New Deal. The New Deal included an increased program of public works, including the Works Progress Administration or WPA. The WPA, established in 1935, was a government organization that employed about 3 million people at its peak. They work at building, bridges, roads, post office, and airports. The Roosevelt administration was also responsible for new social legislation that began the U.S. welfare system. In 1935, the Social Security Act created a system of old age pensions and unemployment insurance. The New Deal provided reforms that perhaps prevented the social revolution in the United States. However, it did not solve the unemployment problems of the Great Depression. In 1938, American unemployment still stood at more than 10 million. Only World War II and the growth of the weapons industries brought U.S. workers back to full employment. Section 2. The Rise of Dictatorial Regimes. In 1932, Benito Mussolini, the dictator of Italy, published a statement of his movement's principles. Anti-individualistic, the fascist conception of life stresses the importance of the state and accepts the individual only insofar as his interests coincide with those of the state. The fascist conception of the state is all-embracing. Outside of it, no human or spiritual values can exist. Thus understood, fascism is totalitarian, and the fascist state interprets, develops, and potentiates the whole life of a people. Fascism does not, generally speaking, believe in the possibility or utility of perpetual peace. War alone keeps up all the human energies to their maximum tension and sets the seal of nobility on those people who have the courage to face it. These were the principles of the movement Mussolini called fascism. The rise of dictators. The apparent triumph of democracy in Europe in 1919 was extremely short-lived. By 1939, only two major European states, France and Great Britain, remained democratic. Italy, the Soviet Union, Germany, and many other European states adopted dictatorial regimes. These regimes took both old and new forms. A new form of dictatorship was the modern totalitarian state. A totalitarian state is a government that aims to control the political, economic, social, intellectual, and cultural lives of its citizens. New totalitarian regimes pushed the power of the central state far beyond what it had been in the past. These totalitarian states wanted more than passive obedience. They wanted to conquer the minds and hearts of their subjects. They achieved this goal through mass propaganda techniques and high-speed modern communication. Modern technology also provided totalitarian states with an unprecedented ability to impose their wishes on their subjects. The totalitarian states that emerged were led by a single leader and a single party. They rejected the ideal of limited government power and the guarantee of individual freedoms. Instead, individual freedom was subordinated to the collective will of the masses. This collective will of the masses, however, was organized and determined by the leader. The totalitarian state expected the active involvement of the masses in the achievement of its goals, whether those goals included war, a socialist state, or a thousand-year empire like the one Adolf Hitler wanted to establish. Fascism in Italy. In the early 90s, Benito Mussolini established the first European fascist movement in Italy. Mussolini began his political career as a socialist. In 1919, he created a new political group, the Fascio di Combattimento or League of Combat. The term fascism is derived from that name. As a political philosophy, fascism glorifies the state above the individual by emphasizing the need for a strong central government led by a dictatorial ruler. In a fascist state, people are controlled by the government and any opposition is suppressed. Rise of fascism. Like other European countries, Italy experienced severe economic problems after World War I. Inflation grew and both industrial and agricultural workers staged strikes. Socialists spoke of revolution. The middle class began to fear a communist takeover, like the one that had recently occurred in Russia. Industrial and agricultural strikes created more division. Mussolini emerged from this background of widespread unrest. In 1920 and 1921, Mussolini formed bands of black-shirted armed fascists called squadristi or black shirts. These bands attacked socialist offices and newspapers. They also used violence to break up strikes. Both middle-class industrialists who feared working-class strikes and large landowners who objected to agricultural strikes began to support Mussolini's fascist movement. By 1922, Mussolini's movement was growing quickly. The middle-class fear of socialism, communism, and disorder made the fascists increasingly attractive to many people. In addition, Mussolini realized that the Italian people were angry over Italy's failure to receive more land in the peace settlement that followed the war. He understood that nationalism was a powerful force, thus, he demanded more land for Italy and won thousands of converts to fascism with his patriotic and nationalistic appeals. In 1922, Mussolini and the fascists threatened to march on Rome if they were not given power. Mussolini exclaimed, "Either we are allowed to govern or we will seize power." Victor Emmanuel III, the King of Italy, gave in and made Mussolini Prime Minister. Mussolini used his position as Prime Minister to create a fascist dictatorship. New laws gave the government the right to suspend any publications that criticize the Catholic Church, the monarchy, or the state. The Prime Minister was made head of the government with the power to make laws by decree. The police were given unrestricted authority to arrest and jail anyone for either non-political or political crimes. In 1926, the fascists outlawed all over political parties in Italy and established a secret police known as the Ovra. By the end of the year, Mussolini ruled Italy as Second Duce or the leader. The fascist state. Since Mussolini believed that the fascist state should be totalitarian, he used various means to establish complete control over the Italian people. As we have seen, Mussolini created a secret police force The obra, whose purpose was to watch citizens' political activities and enforce government policies. Police actions in Italy, however, were never as repressive or savage as those in Nazi Germany. The Italian fascists also tried to exercise control over all forms of mass media, including newspapers, radio, and film. The film was used to spread propaganda. The propaganda was intended to mold Italians into a single-minded fascist community. Most Italian fascist propaganda, however, was fairly unsophisticated and mainly consisted of simple slogans like Mussolini is always right. The fascists also used organizations to promote the ideals of fascism and to control the population. For example, by 1939, fascist youth groups included about 66% of the population between the ages of 8 and 18. These youth groups particularly focused on military activities and values. With this organization, the fascists hoped to create a nation of new Italians who were fit, disciplined, and war-loving. In practice, however, the fascists largely maintained traditional social attitudes. This is especially evident in their policies regarding women. The fascists portrayed the family as a pillar of the state and the women as the foundation of the family. Women were to be the homemakers and mothers, which was their natural and fundamental mission in life, according to Mussolini. Despite his attempts, Mussolini never achieved the degree of totalitarian control seen in Hitler's Germany or Stalin's Soviet Union. The Italian Fascist Party did not completely destroy the country's old power structure. Some institutions, including the armed forces, were not absorbed into the fascist state but managed to keep most of their independence. Victor Emmanuel was also retained as king. Mussolini's compromise with the traditional institutions of Italy was especially evident in his relationship with the Catholic Church. In the Lateran Accords of February 1929, Mussolini's regime recognized the sovereign independence of a small area within Rome known as Vatican City. The Church had claimed this area since 1870. When Mussolini formally recognized that claim, the Pope then recognized the Italian state. Mussolini's regime also gave the church a large grant of money and recognized Catholicism as the sole religion of the state. In return, the Catholic Church urged Italians to support the fascist regime. In all areas of Italian life under Mussolini and the fascists, there was a large gap between the fascist ideals and practices. The Italian fascists promised much but delivered considerably less. They would soon be overshadowed by a much more powerful fascist movement to the north, that of Adolf Hitler, a student and admirer of Mussolini. A new era in the Soviet Union. As we have seen, Lenin followed a policy of war communism during the Civil War in Russia. The government controlled most industries and seized grain from peasants to ensure supplies for the army. Once the war was over, peasants began to sabotage the communist program by hoarding food. The situation became even worse when drought caused a great famine between 1920 and 1922. As many as 5 million lives were lost. With agricultural disaster came industrial collapse. By 1921, industrial output was only 20% of its 1913 level. Russia was exhausted. A peasant banner proclaimed "Down with Lenin and horseflesh. Bring back the Tsar and fork." As Leon Trotsky said, the country and the government with it were at the very edge of the abyss. Lenin's new economic policy. In March 1921, Lenin pulled Russia back from the abyss. He abandoned war communism in favor of his new economic policy, or the NEP. The NEP was a modified version of the old capitalist system. Peasants were allowed to sell their produce openly. Retail stores as well as small industry that employed fewer than 20 workers could be privately owned and operated. Heavy industry, banking, and mines, however, remained in the hands of the government. In 1922, Lenin and the communists formally created a new state called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which is also known as the USSR by its initials, or as the Soviet Union by its shortened form. By that time, a revived market and a good harvest had brought an end to famine. Soviet agricultural production climbed to 75% of its pre-war level. Overall, the NEP saved the Soviet Union from complete economic disaster. Lenin and other lending communists, however, only intended the NEP to be a temporary retreat from the goals of communism. The rise of Stalin. Lenin died in 1924. A struggle for power began at once among the 7 members of the Politburo, a committee that had become the living policy-making body of the Communist Party. The Politburo was severely divided over the future direction of the Soviet Union. One group led by Leon Trotsky wanted to end the NEP and launch Russia on a path of rapid industrialization, chiefly at the expense of the peasants. This group also wanted to spread communism abroad and believed that the revolution in Russia would not survive without other communist states. Another group in the Politburo rejected the idea of worldwide communist revolution. Instead, it wanted to focus on building a socialist state in Russia and to continue Lenin's NEP. This group believed that rapid industrialization would harm the living standards of the Soviet peasants. These divisions were underscored by an intense personal rivalry between Leon Trotsky and another Politburo member, Joseph Stalin. In 1924, Trotsky held the post of Commissar of War. Stalin held the bureaucratic job of Party General Secretary. Because the General Secretary appointed regional, district, city, and town party officials. This bureaucratic job actually became the most important position in the party. Stalin used his post as General Secretary to gain complete control of the Communist Party. The thousands of officials Stalin appointed provided him with support in his bid for power. By 1929, Stalin had eliminated from the Politburo the Bolsheviks of the revolutionary era and had established a powerful dictatorship. Trotsky, expelled from the party in 1927, eventually made his way to Mexico, where he was murdered in 1940, probably on Stalin's order. 5-year plans. The Stalinist era marked the beginning of an economic, social, and political revolution that was more sweeping in its results than were the revolutions of 1917. Stalin made a significant shift in economic policy in 1928 when he ended the NEP and launched his first 5-year plan. The 5-year plan set economic goals for 5-year periods. Their purpose was to transform Russia virtually overnight from an agricultural into an industrial country. The first 5-year plan emphasized maximum production of capital goods, goods devoted to the production of other goods such as heavy machines and armaments. The plan quadrupled the production of heavy machinery and doubled oil production. Between 1928 and 1937, during the first 2 5-year plans, steel production in Russia increased from 4 million to 18 million tons, equivalent to 3.628 to 16.326 million per year. The social and political cost of industrialization were enormous. Little provision was made for caring for the expanded labor force in the cities. The number of workers increased by millions between 1932 and 1940, but total investment in housing actually declined after 1929. The result was that millions of workers and their families live in pitiful conditions. Real wages in industry also declined by 43% between 1928 and 1940. Strict laws even limited where workers could move. To keep workers content, government propaganda stressed the need for sacrifice to create the new socialist state. With rapid industrialization came an equally rapid collectivization of agriculture. Collectivization was a system in which private farms were eliminated. Instead, the government owned all the land while the peasants worked it. Strong resistance to Stalin's plans came from peasants who responded by hoarding crops and killing livestock. However, these actions only led Stalin to step up the program. By 1930, 10 million peasant households had been collectivized. By 1934, 26 million family farms had been collectivized into 250 units. Cost of Stalin's programs. Collectivization was done at tremendous cost. The hoarding of food and the slaughter of livestock produced widespread famine. Stalin himself is supposed to have said that 10 million peasants died in the famines of 1932 and 1933. The only concession Stalin made to the peasants was that each collective farm worker was allowed to have one tiny privately owned garden plot. Stalin's programs had other costs as well. To achieve his goals, Stalin strengthened his control over the party bureaucracy. Those who resisted were sent into forced labor camps in Siberia. Stalin's desire to make all decisions by himself also led to the Great Purge of the 1930s. First to be removed were the old Bolsheviks, those who had been involved in the early days of the movement. Between 1936 and 1938, the most prominent old Bolsheviks were put on trial and condemned to death. During the same time, Stalin purged army officers, diplomats, union officials, party members, intellectuals, and numerous ordinary citizens. An estimated 8 million Russians were arrested. Millions were sent to forced labor camps in Siberia, from which they never returned. Others were executed. The Stalin era also overturned much of the permissive social legislation that was enacted in the early 1920s. To promote equal rights for women, the communists had made the divorce process easier, and they had also encouraged women to work outside the home. After Stalin came to power, the family was praised as a small collective in which parents were responsible for teaching the values of hard work, duty, and discipline to their children. Divorced fathers who did not support their children were heavily fined. Authoritarian states in the West. A number of governments in the Western world were not totalitarian but were authoritarian. These states adopted some of the features of totalitarian states, in particular, their use of police powers. However, the main concern of these authoritarian governments was not to create a new kind of mass society, but to preserve the existing social order. Eastern Europe. Some of these governments were found among the new states of Eastern Europe. At first, it seemed that political democracy would become well established in Eastern Europe after the war. Austria, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, known as the Kingdom of the Serb, Croats, and Slovens until 1929, Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary all adopted parliamentary systems. However, most of these systems were soon replaced by authoritarian regimes. Parliamentary systems failed in most Eastern European states for several reasons. These states had little tradition of political democracy. In addition, they were mostly rural and agrarian. Many of the peasants were illiterate, and much of the land was still dominated by large landowners who feared the peasants. Ethnic conflicts also threatened these countries. Powerful landowners, the churches, and even some members of the small middle class feared land reform communist upheaval, and ethnic conflict. For this reason, these groups look to authoritarian governments to maintain the old system. Only Czechoslovakia, which had the large middle class, a liberal tradition, and a strong industrial base, maintained its political democracy. In Spain too, political democracy failed to survive. Led by General Francisco Franco, Spanish military forces revolted against the democratic government in 1936. A brutal and bloody civil war began. Foreign intervention complicated the Spanish Civil War. The fascist regimes of Italy and Germany aided Franco's forces with arms, money, and men. Hitler used the Spanish Civil War as an opportunity to test the new weapons of his revived Air Force. The horrible destruction of Guernica by German bombers in April 1937 was immortalized in a painting by the Spanish artist Pablo Picasso. The Spanish Republican government was aided by 40,000 foreign volunteers and by trucks, planes, tanks, and military advisors from the Soviet Union. The Spanish Civil War came to an end when Franco's forces captured Madrid in 1939. Franco established a dictatorship that favored large landowners, business people, and the Catholic clergy. Because it favored traditional groups and did not try to control every aspect of people's lives, Franco dictatorship is an example of a regime that was authoritarian rather than totalitarian. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.